I've been part of the punk scene for nearly 30 years. In that time, the queering of the punk scene has become decidedly more noticeable and beautiful to see, with queer and femme musicians and showgoers proudly and boldly taking up more space in the community, while other punks and venues likewise also allow more space for people to show up with their full selves. Punk has always been queer, in the sense that punk music and counterculture has always been about deviance, blurring lines, and pushing the boundaries of acceptability, most notably with seminal bands such as the Slits, Pansy Division, Team Dresch, and Limp Wrist. This episode is the first in a series titled Punk is Queer, exploring the relationship between queer community and punk scene. We're starting off with an excerpt from an interview I did with Cristy Road, punk artist, musician, and zine writer for about 30 years now. Cristy talks about her early days as a teenager in the punk scene in Miami, finding others that she could relate to. Cristy created a playlist for us here at Punksacola. The list walks through some of the songs she was listening to during those years. We'll listen to a bit of Cristy's playlist, and you can find the link to the playlist in the show notes. More excerpts of Cristy's interview will appear in future episodes in this Punk is Queer series. Stay tuned.
I started writing zines or contributing to zines. And I met a bunch of queer people that way, and I had queer pen pals.
Yeah.
And there was a zine called Indigenous Sanity that was a mix between indigenous and androgynous. And this was this was somebody in Texas who I felt like we had these very intense letters and conversations, and we don't keep in touch, but it was such a transformative, important moment of feeling like, well, I'm a queer person and I write for a queer zine, and I'm in this scene of punk rock bands, and, there's a political voice against homophobia, but it feels very isolated. I felt like feeling alone was something that started hitting me and triggering me a little bit later, because when I had my zine and when I had that zine community, I had these really good friends, and then eventually I met a woman named Nancy May, who, she was in pop punk bands, and she had her own zine, and we met at a Green Day show, and we had a band together, and it was just having that best friend, kind of we're gonna take on the world. She was Filipino, and she's awesome. She's an Aries, and she's a mom now. And I was really, we ended up having this falling out, but just having that community. And then I had other friends. I had a lot of friends that I met through bands who saw me and allowed me to be a queer person with crushes and with a life. But yeah, I felt really lonely because I was the only person that I could have that life with. And there's a lot about companionship and visibility and queer resilience and the act of coming out, being comfortable. Where I was definitely still in the closet for a lot of scenes, because some of the politicized scenes, the ska scene, and there was this constant threat of racism and skinhead violence and just stuff that we're already fighting these larger beasts that are societal, and about racism as a predominantly Latino punk rock scene, and a lot of people of color, a lot of and it was normal because we're Florida, we're from Miami, and finding the urge to find that queer community kind of came around the same time period as I started experiencing a lot of sexism and sexual violence in the punk rock community, and I started writing about it, and I had community around it because I had my friends, and eventually I met this woman named Helena, who was also my best friend, and, you know, it's like I always had, she was really badass and would listen, you know, we're still really close, and she, like, validated my experiences, and there was a lot of shitty guys we hated because it was very safe to talk about guys being violent and terrible, and there was so much sexism and so much homophobia that was, like, funny, you know, to the apolitical punk rockers, and I noticed, like, with my friendship with her, and then she ended up marrying Charlie. They're still married and they have kids and stuff, which is really cute. I introduced them, and when I introduced them, it was like, oh, now you have each other, and I was like, let's find me a partner, a wife, a queer person to at least find the revolution with, and that's what happened. I did find a queer community, and I found this revolutionary space when I met you, Lauren, when I started hanging out with the activists, Ben and 80, and this is South Florida activists, and they were like, you've got to go to the Youth Liberation Conference, you got to go to the Youth Liberation Conference, and then my life changed forever, and that was 100% like this gateway event. But, you know, I needed other queer people, and I found other people that were experiencing similar violence, and it was a mix of, like, healing from homophobia and acknowledging, like, wow, like, the homophobia that I experienced between the age of very, you know, very tiny, because it was a very homophobic kind of language in Miami that was very casual, and then entering punk rock. And I wrote a graphic novel called Spit and Passion that is about discovering Green Day and the Pansy Division tour, and the song Coming Clean on Dookie, and how it was this really important kind of gateway to my safety and my resilience. And I don't know, I think that, like, part of finding that political queer punk rock community was part of that safety. And it's funny because on the playlist I made, I left out some queer anthems. I mostly just put a lot of stuff that was like a mile marker for seeing myself and my queerness, and feeling comfortable with it, and feeling like, oh, I could question everything and live this, like, kind of othered life, where even though I didn't feel that really spiritual early connection with a lot of the Riot Girl, a lot of the queercore bands, aside from Pansy Division that I was getting into, there was these women in Florida punk that just kind of made me feel like, wow, like, I can just be like a weird woman that's questioning these things and living this life. And then also just kind of this politicized life where, like, it almost was like, you know, and I've always been queer and bi and what we look at, pansexual, whatever. I never even know. I'm just kind of like, I want a partner. I don't care. You know, I just want love. And then there's this whole other level of queerness that comes with values and kind of the kind of community you feel safe in, the kind of people you interact with, and your expression of gender, which in the community of the anarchist punk rock community that I found, you know, through just going, you know, earlier on to Food Not Bombs and Critical Mass and stuff like that, and then eventually at the Youth Liberation Conference, and just kind of seeing that revolutionary stuff. It was like, wow, this is where I need to be to heal, to evolve.
Regular Punksacola listeners will remember Mark Gubb, our July artist-in-residence at 309 Punk Project, who came from Wales to investigate connections between that country and the Pensacola area. One such connection is the Welsh professional wrestler, the Exotic Adrian Street, who was active from the 1950s through the 1980s and retired in Gulf Breeze, where he ran a wrestling school until it was closed by Hurricane Ivan in 2004. Besides presenting in the ring in flamboyant, effeminate attire, Street also sang glam rock songs, including Sweet Transvestite with a Broken Nose. Mark Gubb spearheaded this cover of that song, featuring the local drag performer Wanda Doomy on vocals and Mark on guitar. Punk is really all about making an investment, giving back, and contributing to make our scene the best it can be and to support each other. That's the ideal anyway. I sat down with Laynie over lunch and talked about the evolution of our scene here in Pensacola and how we all play a part in shaping the punk community.
My name's Laynie. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the community. I'm involved in various community organizations, and I feel really strongly about the scene and DIY and the role that that has in building community and maintaining healthy communities.
Like, we have Stance, which is a film festival here, right? And you're involved with that. Not punk related, but it's just part of our cultural, milieu of our community here in Pensacola. We have Sunday's Child, which is a charity organization that specifically is upfront and very explicit about being LGBTQ-led and promoting that in the community. And then we have this punk scene or DIY scene or live music scene or really however we want to kind of conceptualize it that has a lot of bands and a lot of people in the scene who are very open and obviously out about who they are, in particular like various queer folk, queer identified people. Why do we have all that in Pensacola? Like, how is that even possible?
I still don't know. I only moved to Pensacola about 6 was 2011. It was maybe like 12 years ago, 13 years ago.
That's plenty of time.
Right. It took me a while to sort of understand this community, because as soon as I felt like I had sort of one understanding of what it was and the things that happened here, something else would kind of just unearth and be like, oh, maybe this is what this community is about. So we're small enough that like we can say, yeah, we should be aware of each other, and we should be supporting each other and leaning on each other to make particularly arts and culture in this community more broad than it is. So seeing the sort of post-COVID new injection of queer energy into the punk scene in Pensacola has been really, really cool. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. I think some of the reasons for that are there were these teenagers who just sort of grew up on the internet and got to define their own identities that way. The self-determination of that is really, really cool, because then once they were legally able to go to bars, the bars had changed, the scene had changed, people have left, things have evolved, and they were able to redefine what it means to be out in this community. And I think that's true for queerness overall, but I think that's true in a really particular way in small communities. I think being in a small community allows for more let's just do it kind of energy, right? It doesn't already exist. Someone's not telling us how to do it, or this is the correct way to do it, so let's just build it. And I've had these talks with friends who are my age and older who were really, really active in the Sluggos days, in curating shows and trying to do weird art things there. And yeah, it looked a certain way, but it wasn't nearly as queer as it is in the here and now. And I think there not being the pressure of like, it has to look like what's already happening really informed that. Punk has always been queer. Punk spaces have not always been okay spaces for queer people to exist in. So we have the power to redefine that as we grow and evolve as a community. And I think in small communities, we have even more of an ability to do that.
That the young people now maybe are leading a lot of the change. On the flip side, and I was sharing this with, I shared this with Medieval Times when I did the interview with them, is that from my experience as a young, like early 20s, late teenager, early 20s person in the punk scene, it was actually the older people who were more of a balancing of like challenging people for their homophobia or their racism or their just being fucked up. Like they were like, whoa, like what are you doing? Like they were more conscious, whatever you want to say. So it was interesting, like it was more that the older, not everybody, but there was the PC punks, like which were always associated with End of Line and with 309
Absolutely.
That were like more challenging the younger people who tended to be more fucked up. Like they were just dumb and said a bunch of dumb stuff, like really.
I don't think it's an either or answer. I think it's an and both answer. And I think something that has allowed the younger generation as it is now to take the lead in the ways that they have now is having people like Jess Laws to say like, yes, absolutely, let's do this, or having something that is now a permanent part of the community like 309 as it is now, to say this is why this matters and this is why this is important and this is a space where we can exist. And so I do think it's a balance thing, and I think it's almost a like giving of permission, right? Like having people who are who share values and worldview enough to say like, absolutely people should be able to define their own community, and absolutely we should interrogate the things that maybe were really fucked up. Why was that allowed to be as loud as it was in the first place? And that was never punk, but why was it at the forefront of the scene in the way that it was?
As there's backlash and as there's other forces that are attempting to silence people and disappear people, do you think that will change because it's being suppressed? I just see that it's so much harder now than it was 2 years ago. To just be oneself. So I think yes and no, right? I think there are more and more ways that people can be themselves and engage with other people that they can see themselves in. And I think that's one of the benefits of technology being the way that it is. The goal is always find in-person connections. I think that's part of being a human, being a well-adjusted human.
is having a community that we feel like we belong to. And people belonging to each other is just part of coping with the human experience. But because we have access to documented, like I can send someone to 309's website and say, this is something that exists in your community that you might not have known about.
Yeah, and you can look
or
at
I can tell people, Stamp Film Festival is something that has existed in this community for 12 years. You might feel scared to go to the bathroom in Target. However, just for this one weekend, you can be in this building with all of these people who the purpose of our existence is protecting our own community and supporting each other.
The punk community, if you want to say, is very much about the physical space and very much about
lived
the physical
experiences that
interaction.
happen in person.
Yeah. I mean, sweating on each other and
like literally
rubbing on each other and singing together.
I talk about that all the time.
So that's one thing that's always been interesting to me, especially like we say in the last few years, is like going to shows, going to different places, going to Lady Fest, going to just whatever. Punk's a drag event at the Handlebar, whatever. And just like seeing so many people who are doing whatever and they're walking around like just being happy with who they are.
Right. In ways that were different than I can think of, like, so being, 21 and walking around Sluggos and seeing, it's like there were very clear rules, right? Like this is the way to fit in here. And there were always times I felt like I didn't fit in there. And it was, in retrospect, I realize now this was very about queerness. I wasn't being a woman in the right way, right? I wasn't being fuckable enough or whatever for the way the scene existed at the time. People being more willing to take up space in their visible queerness and people being more willing to construct and define their visible queerness without the pressure of sort of the social rules that came with the community not that long ago. Define all of your own identities. We can't lose sight of our history. We can't lose sight of the places that we came from. And so there's all this online discourse about, can you be a trans man that defines himself as a lesbian and like all of these things, and is that allowed? And it's like, first of all, you don't get to tell other people what they're allowed and not allowed to do when it comes to their own identities. Second, this is not new, right? Like, this is not some new concept that came out of nowhere. Like, if you look at all of the documentation of queer lived experiences all the way back to the beginning of that documentation, that is a part of our history.
Yeah. And those in-person spaces sometimes allow that history to be more visible.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
more represented. You can physically see buildings, but you can also like interact with people who are different ages, different, have different backgrounds and that kind of thing.
Well, that's something I love about an archival project. So like what 309 just did with the A to Z, that is the importance of making these connections with people so that, one, we're not just repeating the same bullshit we've always done. It means we're also repeating the same mistakes. But two, so that we're learning and growing and building on what has always been there. And we're not egocentric enough to believe that we're inventing it, right? We can redefine it, we can build on what has already come. But like, I think it is a really egocentric worldview to say, like, oh, well, we're the best generation because of this. Maybe our mentors were just more oppressed in different ways than we are right now. How
do the two things interact with each other? The people that we've just talked about who are taking up more space, who are out there, who are participating and all of that, are we changing the culture? Or was the culture changing and giving us the ability to do that, or both?
Both. I mean, I think it's. I will always say both. I'm a very and both kind of person. But yeah, it's absolutely both. Like having the space to push back and say, yes, I can be this visibly queer at the Handlebar. Yes, I can do. I can do an alternative drag show in Pensacola, right? Because that scene in and of itself, like the queer scene in Pensacola, has changed so much since, the days of Emerald City and what those shows looked like and what that art looked like and sort of the rules of being queer in those spaces. There's more and more room to say, why can't I have both of these things? Why can't an alternative drag show happen at the Handlebar? Where people who are both punk and queer come out to experience both of those identities happening simultaneously. I think there's almost this pressure to say, like, don't make this the mainstream. Like, it's counterculture for a reason. Like, we don't need more mainstream, whatever. We need to protect our community. I think of course, there's truth to that. And, of course, we feel protective over that.
Like, we don't want everyone to just be in on the story. Like, this is an inside joke, kind of thing.
But then there's also a lot of safety in that, right? There's a lot of safety in being able to say, in Pensacola, Florida, someone can go from one venue to their next venue in full drag and maybe not be as worried about their life as they would have been at some earlier point in history. But we're seeing politically, that there's a lot of fear around things, like the 3-garment rule and, things like that. All of these things can come back at any moment. And so I don't think at any time we should allow ourselves to be too comfortable in that, they're willing to come to our parties. We have to continue to say, like, okay, you're willing to come to our parties. When are you going to use your political power to create safety for these members of your community? Because we are members of your community. We've, really lost our tolerance for uncomfortable conversations and for giving uncomfortable feedback. Offending people, not offending people is not the point, right? Tolerance for conflict and tolerance for meaningful conversation is the point. And I think just collectively as a culture, I think we're bad at that. No matter what political leanings or identities you have, I think we're not good at it. And we would all benefit from getting better at it.
Well, is there anything else you want to say that we didn't go into?
I mean, this has been lovely. I really like taking the time to reflect on why this community is the way that it is right now. Sometimes I feel like Pensacola is a really special place because of where we exist. We could have an entirely separate conversation about the intersection of Southern identity and the importance of that that is why this matters. That is why it matters that all of this is happening in Pensacola. I just love that all of this exists.
In an homage to ink and paper punk scenes of yesteryear and in support of our vibrant and thriving DIY music scenes, Punksacola Audiozine features a scene report. We want to hear from you. We want to know what's going on in your local live music scene. Get in touch if you want to submit a piece. Here is the Punksacola Audiozine scene report.
I've seen her once before over in Tallahassee. It was her first show back there since the very infamous one a decade and a half or so ago. And that was an acoustic show, so it was really cool to see her with a full band. Even if it's not the full Against Me lineup, they're killing it.
How do you think the new songs hold up?
I think they're pretty solid. It's definitely a different vibe. I think she's kind of grown out of the teen, early 20s angst, and is a little more reflective and mature in her sound now, which I think is really cool. You can kind of track that growth through her discography.
Absolutely. So, how do you feel about the show tonight? How's it going?
It was awesome. It was honestly one of the best shows I've ever been to.
Really? Why do you say that?
I just think every band, even the openers, were so happy to be here, and we were all just so happy to be here.
That makes a great vibe, right? Even though it's hot as hell and the room is packed,
You could feel it.
It just made it all better, right?
Exactly.
Anything that highlighted and stuck out to you that you particularly were surprised by or enjoyed?
I was surprised that obviously Laura did Sing Florida Sing at the very end of her original set. It really made it.
She's really generous with her time and coming out and doing encores and everything.
Exactly. And you can tell she cares so much about not just Florida but the area, Pensacola. It makes me really happy.
It was phenomenal.
Yeah?
Yeah, it was.
Phenomenal is a very strong word. Why do you say that?
Everybody here was positive and happy and full, and we're all sweaty, and it was great.
It was so awesome, right?
Yeah.
Leaving a show drenched and happy is amazing. That's what I want every
Leaving the
time.
show drenched and happy.
Yes.
What was your favorite? Anything that stood out to you that like surprised you or that just like knocked your socks off?
I've never heard of Catbite until tonight.
And they were just
Phenomenal.
amazing, right?
And that's why we're going to buy a t-shirt. Also, I've missed all the Pauper's grave shows. I know who they are, but I haven't got to see them yet, and seeing them
Getting
tonight.
better and better every time they play. Anything about for you, like what stood out to you?
Just the energy. Everyone was energetic. Normally at shows you kind of gotta encourage it.
Thanks for listening to the latest episode of the Punksacola Audiozine. We are coming to you from Pensacola, Florida, in the southeastern U.S., the traditional homeland of the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, and Seminole peoples. We at the 309 Punk Project truly appreciate your support and efforts with us to preserve and promote punk and DIY culture and arts that inspire and enrich all of our lives. Check out our news and events, donate, get in touch, or join our distro list, all at 309punkproject.org. Let's close out this episode with Los Canadians Never Can, one of the songs from Cristy's playlist.